Thank you so much. It's I've been, extremely grateful for the generous attention and time that people are giving for my silly lectures. And this is sort of the last installment of this quixotic series, which is not directly connected to the previous one. And I will say right away, I know nothing about history. So you may ask, what am I doing here? Well, part of my role oftentimes in discussions about history is to somewhat try to entertain other people by being sort of like a jester. Just ask stupid questions that other people might be too dignified to ask. And that's largely what this lecture is about. But I'll also mention two other motivations in some sense. Part of it is what Roger has already referred to. At our center in Edinburgh, International Center for Mathematical Sciences, we have a program called Mathematics for Humanity, where we support a lot of activity in the mathematical sciences, broadly interpreted, that have the potential to directly benefit human welfare. So that's what the program is about. It seems, yeah. Does it help if I speak a little louder, whoever is online?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Sorry? Oh, okay, yeah. I'll try to speak loudly. So this is the kind of program that you can imagine. We're trying to support really a broad range of activities, including things having to do with so immediate challenges like climate change, equitable economies, but also mathematical approaches to democracy and so on. But within the themes of this program, you'll find this thing, a theme called the global history of mathematics. And I've received a lot of queries about what this is doing here within this program, which is supposed to be Mathematics for Humanity. And for me, the answer is evident, but it seems it's not evident for too many people. For example, even for potential funders of the program, people who make donations, they sometimes ask, what does this have to do with human welfare? And so I'm in the process of writing an article explaining this in a rather broad sense. And I'm using you in some sense to help me write this article, because that brings me to the second point for why I might be giving a talk like this. I don't know how many of you know this idea of the flipped classroom. You know what that is? Some of you may have heard of it. It's an idea that's very popular in the US about teaching. It's about teaching where the lecturer and the students exchange places. You imagine various ways in which you might implement a principle of that sort. Some people love it, for other people it's controversial. I find it rather inspiring in myself. So even though I haven't taught in about 5 years, I still think about it now and then. And I even bring it to my seminars. That is, when I give a talk, I don't focus on imparting information to the audience, but rather talk about things where the audience will teach me something. So that's what this is about, especially since in this room in particular, and in India in general, I find that people are really very knowledgeable about history. So I hope you'll give some feedback, criticize what I have to say, and thereby help me improve my perspective on some of the topics that will come up. So, what? Oh, sorry, what's happening? So here's one other preliminary to the main. What? But he has fixed screen sharing to this page, so I'll just have that share again. Okay, there we go. So I'll just start, before getting to mathematics, I'll just start with a very personal anecdote about my encounters of history when I was young. This is the so-called Three Kingdoms period in Korean history, usually said to go from along those dates that you see at the top of the screen. And this is supposed to be the rough map around 476 of the Common Era. So the idea of a Three Kingdom period some Korean historians probably like the idea of the Three Kingdom period in China and try to write their stories to reflect this admiration. Well, the first thing you'll notice is that there aren't three kingdoms, right? That was always puzzling to me because for at least during this period, at least about 500 years of that period, this was roughly what the map looked like. Not very different from this. So why three kingdoms? So this is the kind of thing that was always very puzzling to me. So then around 667, I don't know how it exactly squares up with those dates because all of these are estimates. That's probably why. But 676, rather, the three kingdoms were unified by Silla. That's the way the story is usually told. And so I deliberately made the maps somewhat to scale. And so when you look at this, you might wonder many things, right? So for example, I used to wonder, what do they mean by unification? I mean, this looks very different from this, right? But this is the beginning of the so-called unified Silla period, which is supposed to have happened after you unified the three kingdoms, right? So very puzzling. And then, of course, some kids used to say, well, it's too bad that this kingdom at the top, Goguryeo, did not unify the three kingdoms. Maybe Korea would be enormous like that right now. So that's another more nationalistic perspective you may take. But you can ask many questions anyways about it. So when people said things like that, I don't know if maybe I'm projecting my thoughts now back into the past when I was young. But even then I wondered, what do these people have to do with me now? That's another way of asking your the question about, I mean, the different modes of unification. And then as you keep going on about this, then you start asking questions like, who the hell drew these maps anyways? How do they figure these things out? So of course, at some level, we're not really qualified. I'm not really qualified to ask these questions, but as over the years in my conversation with people who are qualified, the answers I've got, I have to admit, are not very inspiring. So partly it has to do with what we as mathematicians are very annoying about, right? Definitions. Definitions are very hard to find in some suitable form when talking to historians, and then evidence and so on. So anyways, so that's just a preliminary, right, about the personal history of encounter with history in the past. So now I'll move on to the main discussion of who owns mathematics. And I think everybody here knows the answer to that question. And I don't think anybody will disagree with this slide, the sentiments expressed by Kamran Vafa, who is both a mathematician and a physicist, right? And this is what he said. Maybe we should briefly read this together. This was a short time after he received the Breakthrough Prize. He said, science is a timeless, borderless adventure. If we take a snapshot of science today, we'll see various centers of excellence, some places that may be relatively quiet, but we should view this as not the property of science, but as transient phenomena. Sometimes science is strong in one place, sometimes in another. It's not the territory of a particular area. It's not the territory of a particular people. And it's an adventure for the entire humankind. So I've given these lectures in North America, in Europe here. I don't think anybody disagrees with this, right? Clearly, nobody can disagree. But the way in which we agree with this, I think there's so many nuances and subtleties in what we mean when we disagree with a sentiment like that. And that's partly what a lot of my stupid questions about history are about. Okay? So let's start just by illustrating with a concrete example, Vafa's general principle. Well, it's not his principle, but that he articulated in that previous slide in that lecture. I'll just start with an example. You see, this was originally born as a public lecture. So there was I tried to mix in some mathematical ingredients, which certainly is not necessary for this audience, but you might find amusing anyways. Right? So this is this picture of this stone tablet, which is dated to around 1800 BCE. YBC means Yale Babylonian collection. And this is often said to contain a remarkably accurate approximation to the square root of 2. I'm sure there are people here who know this much better than I do, but you have to read this cuneiform, and there's this question of place values and so on that makes it slightly ambiguous. But in any case, when you've deciphered all this is the Babylonian approximation to the square root, which is, of course, remarkably accurate. This is what I get on my phone if I calculate for the square root of 2 now. And so people have wondered how they calculated these things to great accuracy, but there is something that was traditionally called Babylonian algorithm for calculating square roots, which has other names as well. But anyways, for now, I'll call it the Babylonian algorithm. So it has to do with the following process, where you start with, in order to calculate the square root of any number, you can start with any guess at all, of course. You probably will start with a reasonably close guess, like for square root of 2, you might start with 1 or something like that. And then you iterate an algorithm to make it more and more accurate. So this seems to be one of the very early iterative recursive algorithms in history as well. So here's how it goes. So you define the next approximation to be the average of A1 and D divided by A1. Okay? And then the next one, you do the same thing with A2 and so on. So this is the Babylonian algorithm. As I said, it's a very simple recursion, a remarkable idea in its own way. And for example, if you did this for square root of 2 and started with A1 equals 1, then A2 would be 1.5, already quite close, right? And if you do A3, A3, you get something that's quite close indeed. At A4, you already see this 1.414, which is a figure that some of us memorize as the decimal approximation to square root of 2. I'll also explain to you briefly why this works. This was, as I said, prepared for the general public, so probably unnecessary for this audience. But this picture says it all, essentially. So what's the idea? Well, we know that A1 times D over A1, if you multiply that, you get 2D. And also square root of D times square root of D is D, right? So if this happens to be less than square root of D, then this thing here is bigger than square root of D, and vice versa, right? So you get a picture like this. So when you take the average of the two, you get more close to square root. That's the general idea. So that's the process. I've been told, anyways, or I've read here and there, that this is such an efficient algorithm that we still use it in our calculators now. Maybe some of you can correct me if this is wrong. But as far as square roots are concerned, there's no better way. Even now, after thousands of years, we still use this method in our calculators. Other people have, of course, done other things with it, right? Because then this turns into various refinements, generalizations, and so on. I just put down some random names here, right, that have to do with somehow this process of finding, of naming and approximating roots of polynomials, right? Many people from all over the world have contributed to this process. You can insert more names, or if you want, right? Some of you will wish to do that. What's remarkable to me, anyways, about this algorithm, when this problem of finding roots of polynomials is concerned, it was completely resolved. Actually, maybe somebody knows. Do you know when this problem was completely resolved? Finding roots of polynomials? Does somebody here know? Numerically, that's right. Yeah. Well, if some of you learned Newton method during calculus, you'll know that it doesn't always work, right? There's various subtleties about when it works, when it doesn't, does it find all the roots and so on, right? So the method that we usually learn in school, there's lots of incomplete aspects of it. Right? So a complete resolution of this problem was only in 2001, in the 21st century. So this is a paper, how to find more complex roots of Newton's method, what's called Newton's method. And this is a picture from the paper showing so you view Newton's method as a dynamical system on the complex plane, and it has domains of attraction and boundaries of the domains of attraction and so on. So what they do is they give you an effective way of dividing up the plane into finitely many regions so that each one will contain at least one root. Yeah? And there's a finite algorithm which will either converge to that root or at some point you can abandon it. That tells you that there's nothing in that region. So that's what they completely write down. But this one only in the 21st century. So I find this rather remarkable, actually, right? And it really is an illustration of Vafa's principle, right? All these contributions from all over the world over almost 4,000 years, right? This is 4,000 years of collective research by the whole world, which leaves us with this heritage, mathematical heritage of humanity, right? There's a good illustration that this is a global effort and a global heritage, right? Nonetheless, even this thing that we believe, as I said, there are misconceptions surrounding it. So I'm going to go into that. That's what I'll go into right now. Having started out with a positive story, now we'll discuss a little bit of the difficulties and misconceptions. So here's a picture that I like very much. Many of you will know this person. This is usually shortened to Al-Biruni, who lived at the height of the golden age of Islam. But this picture is very interesting because you can easily see what this picture is, right? What is it? It's a stamp. It's obviously a stamp, right? Where was it issued? Clearly, it's the Soviet Union, right? In 1973. So the next question, I usually don't get an answer to this in Europe, but somebody here must surely know. Why was this issued in the Soviet Union? So everybody here knows, good. When I asked in North America or Europe, nobody knew the answer to this question, right? Okay. Hmm? Right. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Yeah, very good point. Who was, of course, born very close to this region as well, right? So, sorry? Right. So, yeah, so he was born in present. Yes, well, you can omit this because actually I was going to go in a different direction in the public lecture. But for now, I'll just mention that this, he was born in present-day Uzbekistan, of course, right? Which at that time was part of the Soviet Union. And Soviets were as supportive of multicultural ethnic diversity as much as any of us are now, right? And they did this in commemoration, I guess, of 1,000 years of his birth here. And this was in 1973. As a proud Soviet citizen. So here's a question, right? Was he in fact Soviet? Now, this sounds very ridiculous, but I don't find it so strange myself because a lot of the identities that we have in mind now and take for granted are just as funny as this, I think. If you inquire into what's really going on, what leads people to this identity. For example, if I say that he was Uzbek, is that better? If some people might think it sounds worse, maybe some people think it sounds better. I don't really know. Now, was he Iranian? How's that? What do you think about that? Any takers to this idea?
Culturally, he was probably something like similar culture.
Very similar culture.
And probably worked in, but not only Iraq and so on.
So okay. So yeah, indeed, this is definitions. I told you, this lecture is all about definitions. Yeah? But so then, do you like the answer that he was Uzbek? So there we go. Anyway, so also I found that when I asked this question, there's also a subtle difference with saying that he was Persian, with many different complexities surrounding these different labels, right? So it's very interesting to even distinguish these two possible classifications. Now, so I'm just listing a few. A fifth possibility, maybe it was Arabic. How's that? I've met historians who argue strenuously against the idea that he was Arabic for various reasons. Maybe some of you know reasons why he wasn't Arabic. Al certainly seems Arabic, right? So there we go, yeah. Yeah. Like the first German, Arminius, is Roman, right? So there's all kinds of things like this. Certainly, Al-Biruni makes him sound Arabic, right? So, okay, we'll return to this point later.
What exactly?
Sorry? Yeah. Unfortunately, we can't ask him. I haven't read enough of his works to see if some reference to it exists. By the way, since we're on Al-Biruni, I'm very curious to know what people in India think about his book on India. He has this famous book on India, right? I've only looked at a few things. It's fascinating, actually, right? And sorry, yeah, which one is that?
A mixture of worlds, but mostly
That's right. But Albironi was very prolific, right? So he wrote about India, he wrote about mathematics, physics, astronomy, anthropology, all kinds of things under the sun. So according to some estimate, if you transcribe his books into current day normal book pages, it still would be around 20,000 pages. So he wrote a lot, but very little of it is translated. But his book on India is translated into English. So I've just dipped into it here and there. I didn't find that passage. I found lots of kind of, I see. I'll go to get to that in a second. Okay, I'll get to that.
But also, in this case, it's additionally perhaps complicated because he traveled so much.
He traveled a lot, of course. That's right, yeah. Indeed.
Spent large periods of time across.
So where he died was in Ghazni, right? Yeah, which of course is in current day Afghanistan. So maybe he was Afghani. Right? He spent a long time in Afghanistan, supported by the emperor. Okay. Right. So anyway, it's fun to ask these questions in the manner of a jester at court. Especially if you're in the presence of a distinguished historian, then you're really like the jester at court. Right? And I've done this in the past, and it's kind of fun. Now, so these were just questions, but now let's move on to direct misconceptions, right? Which also are interesting. Right? So here's a quotation from Alfred North Whitehead, Introduction to Mathematics. So maybe we should read this together. The death of Archimedes by the hands of a Roman soldier is symbolical of a world change of the first magnitude. The theoretical Greeks, with their love of abstract science, were superseded in the leadership of the European world by the practical Romans. Now, I find this to be a remarkable passage in many ways, right? But, well, so let's start asking a few questions. Again, my stupid questions about it. So one of the things that appear in here, it appears more directly in other parts of the book. I guess I didn't really quote the relevant passage, but I hope it's evident enough from this paragraph that somehow he is referring to this theory of the type that Rome didn't have any mathematicians. This is something that people often say, right? So maybe some people here have an idea. Why were there no Roman mathematicians? Sorry? Well, Roman number system is famously bad, of course. Do you think the Greek one was better? I don't know. It's very interesting. Yeah. But do people here know? People, of course, people have discussed this question and theorized about it quite a lot. And maybe somebody here has an idea?
Depends on, again, what you mean by mathematicians. They were very famous for their engineering.
That's certainly true too. That's an important point. By the way, when people talk about it, mathematicians in the ancient world, this definition is something they play with a lot in order to fit theories. That's also a good point, right? Anything else? By the way, this question is a question that has a definite answer. I don't need sociological theorizing to answer this question. There's a definite answer. Anybody knows what the definite answer is? I can say this confident. The mathematicians, that's right.
Or the perception that Rome didn't have.
You're being very, very cagey and careful. So I'm going to deliberately not clarify what I mean by that question. Yeah. Sorry? Oh, that would be quite drastic, right? But I know. Besides, in order to give an answer like that, I would actually have to know something. But I can answer this question. So if you're a mathematician that says that there's a definite answer with very little knowledge, the answer must have to do with something very, very simple, right? So, okay, so there you go. I think some of you are already hinting at the right answer. So here's a hint, right? So here are some mathematicians of the Roman Empire. Very distinguished people by any measure, right? Very good point. Very good point. That's right, yeah. Very interesting point.
Is the first part of the statement have any evidence that
We'll get to that as well. That's another aspect of it. But let's first finish discussing this question. Why were there no Roman mathematicians? But you're giving sort of the right answer, because if I, as a mathematician, can say there's definitely an answer to this question, right? The reason is that it's because they are regarded as non-Roman by definition. Roman mathematicians were all defined out of existence. This is true. This I pretty much checked with the experts as well. Anybody who might be a Roman mathematician is defined out of existence. That's why there are no Roman mathematicians. Now, the other aspects of this thing is also very strange. You know, it is also remarkable besides this question of.
So, say to define it out of existence, of course, you have to have some. So they classified anyone outside the city of Rome, outside the Italian peninsula.
All of those are very, very complicated questions, right? So I'll explain a little bit later what I mean by this slightly better. Okay, so you know, these are all very good questions, very difficult to answer. But in the meanwhile, let's also look at some of before moving on, just few other aspects of it. So somebody was pointing out this is also remarkable, right? I mean, so here I'm going to be slightly controversial and maybe slightly unfair, but if you look at Victorian education in Britain, it's very remarkable sometimes. You know? Somebody who is regarded as a good intellectual can take a complete mythology like this, tell it as though it were history, and build a theory of civilization on top of it and put it into a book. This was admissible in those days, right? It's quite remarkable that people can do things like this. I mean, you'd never get away with something like this these days anyways as a historian, unless you were some kind of populist like Jordan Peterson or one of these, I don't know. But yeah, okay. So that's why I said if you're a public intellectual of some sort, you can get away with it. But it's hard to be taken seriously in the academic community by building up a story like this in some way. I think that in that way history has improved. But we can disagree about that. But anyways, for the moment, it's very strange. But okay. But you know, but these were all the days. These were the good old days when if you just knew some Greek and Roman classics then you got to be regarded as a learned person somehow. So it's a very strange environment in which the ideas like this. Sorry?
You have to live in the center of the world as well.
Okay. Anyways, so maybe we'll return to that point as well. But anyways, okay. So for the moment, I'll just say. The answer to this question is that Rome didn't have mathematicians because they were defined out of existence. Let's move on to some other misconceptions, things that is slightly harder to laugh at these days. Right? So for example, here's a quotation from Thomas Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia. Jefferson, as you know, was himself, besides being a politician, quite an influential intellectual. He was well-read in science and philosophy and the classics. So here's what he wrote about blacks and mathematics in this book. So essentially what he says, so it goes on in the subsequent portions, but what he's saying is that there are some things that blacks seem to be able to do, memory, reason, imagination. On the other hand, there's no way they can do mathematics. That's what he says. Well, that's the question, right? So that's the very curious thing. Of course, nobody knows anything about Euclid's ethnicity. There's very little we know about Euclid. We don't know if it was a man or a woman or a collective or whether the person existed. But in any case, most people agree that they probably lived their whole life in Africa, right? That about this, there seems to be general agreement in the ancient sources. But nonetheless, if we try to sort of formulate Jefferson's way of thinking about this question in slightly modern language, right? It probably means something like this, right? So, indeed, what is it? That's right. I can tell you, this is better statement than Jefferson's. I can explain what this means. Maybe some of you know who Sally Hemings is. That's right. It was the slave with whom he had children, the black slave with whom he had children. So this thing here refers to genetic distance. Yeah? That is a notion that can be given some kind of a definition these days by comparing genomes and comparing base pairs and things of this. So biologists do pretty regularly work with this notion of genetic distance. So if you try to make sense of what Jefferson is saying in modern terms, he's claiming something like this. Right? Given all this uncertainty, of course, does anybody believe this? I certainly don't believe that we can say anything about this, right? But, It's very hard to say. I suspect that the inequality goes this way. I strongly suspect that it goes that way. Right? So it's interesting. What did he have in mind when he was thinking about things like this? Especially since most of you probably know by now, according to the way scientists are thinking about it now, there's no such thing as race. Race is not a concept that makes sense. This is a notion that sometimes generates a lot of confusion, right? So what do we mean when we say, but as mathematicians and physicists, we can understand, discuss this very easily. Within the general population, sometimes this idea that there's no race generates a lot of confusion. So what do we mean by it? It means that if you take the whole of humankind, right, and put their data into a large dimensional data space, right, whatever measurements or sizable measurements you'd like to take, whether these are genotypes, or a sufficiently large collection of physical measurements, you put it into a large data space. Of course, there's tremendous variation, right? Nobody's saying there isn't variation. We all look different in this room, right? There's tremendous variation, but there's no clustering. That's the statement. There's no sensible clustering. So this is one question I have looked at reasonably carefully. There's still some controversy about this, but there are still a minority of people who claim that it can be clustered. Right? But it's very unconvincing when you look at it. And by the way, so even within the hardline people who still believe you can, there is clustering. A lot of Indians are included among the whites, by the way. So anyways, so the categories that Jefferson was speaking about really doesn't make sense from a scientific perspective. Mm-hmm. 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 You mean, right?
Some other word which
Mm.
later.
Right.
So, yeah, so I don't know if any of these inequalities have a person.
Well, let's assume that the person existed. Yeah.
I think it's more that the person is trusted deliberately.
Mm.
Construction of an identity will satisfy the inequality.
Indeed, that's right, yeah. That's a very, very good point. Yeah, and I'll return to that point later as well. Thank you very much. That's very well articulated, better than I could have anyways. But anyway, so it's a very confusing thing that he's saying if we look at it from a modern perspective. And it certainly doesn't make any sense from a biological perspective. So by the way, the fact that we have all this enormous diversity in the world, but there's no clustering, it leads me to formulate a kind of slogan, right? The world is full of diversity and unity. It's clearly true, right? Diversity because all kinds of people, unity because you can't divide it. That is a reasonable, scientifically evidenced statement to make. Anyway, so here's another misconception besides whiteheads. So of course, the ancient world and scientists in them it was all mixed up. They were spread all around the Mediterranean, for example, these famous personalities that we knew. And so when we try to identify them in some way that using labels that we might use now for different parts of the world, it's very difficult. But it was already pointed out, right, that there was a labeling that's traditional about this, right? And you said it earlier, right? All of them were regarded as what? Greek, right? They were all regarded as Greek. Right? That was the standard label. So now let's discuss that a little. Yeah. Right?
So much about Pythagoras
We don't know whether he existed. That's right. That's right. So indeed, even somebody who's relatively close to the time of Pythagoras, like Aristotle, never talks about Pythagoras. He talks about the Pythagoreans. That's right. Yeah, exactly. That's also true. That's right. Sorry? Eratosthenes? Eratosthenes. So he may have been there at some point, for example, as might appear in his correspondence with Archimedes, but usually his birthplace is said to be in somewhere in Libya. That's in current day Tunisia. Sorry? Right. That's right. So, but one interesting thing, by the way, this is already coming up in some of the comments you're making. Even this list of statements over here are based on very, very few sources. most of things that were written hundreds of years after the personalities themselves. Uh-huh. Right.
Things I have read.
That's certainly true too. Yeah. That I don't know. I mean, but
Euclid credits Pythagoras.
that's right. Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. About any so.
Also, the other things that we know about Pythagoras makes the Pythagorean school almost sound something like the ancient Greek version of Jonestown.
I don't think I know what Jonestown. Yeah, it does seem to have been a cult, but anyways, all of these are based on so few sources who themselves were writing with all kinds of motivations that sometimes is not actually interrogated properly. So what these things mean, all of them are very, actually, to be honest, about ancient history, I myself believe almost nothing at this point. But anyway, that's a separate matter. Okay. But let's discuss a little bit this identification that normally comes up where these people are called Greeks. So a few years ago, I think, when was it? I think I wrote it here, 2 years ago or 3 years ago, there was this book called Greeks, A Global History. It's actually quite a good book, highly recommend it, because it's really trying to give an account of people who might be called Greeks from all over the world and how they evolved. The notion also evolved through the millennia. But this author, so he's a professor of history at King's College. He is clearly aware of this difficulty, right? Mainly the definition of difficulty. How do we say what a Greek is? So he's aware of this problem because in the introduction, so here's what he says in order to explain what he means by this title. Here's what he says in the introduction. That's what he says. So now one can think many things about this. Well, there's one obvious error, by the way, even with this, right? If you take the personalities that appear in this book, most of these people, we have no idea what they spoke, what they actually spoke, we have no idea. There are very few extant sources of writings on the basis of which even this definition is being applied. So that's actually an obvious error in his book, which I find somewhat inexcusable. But anyways, but another aspect of it is that you could say, okay, so that's the definition. You can define anything you want and then work on the basis of that definition. That's sort of like the physicist, sorry, let me say. There's no way I would criticize physicists in this room for whom I have nothing but the greatest respect. I was about to talk about philosophers. To say that any definition is fine is sort of like the philosopher's caricature of mathematics. Right? Not any definition is fine in mathematics either. We don't define things whatever we want and then derive consequences and prove theorems about it. Some definitions we feel to be reasonable, right? And some we don't. Like Euclid's axioms seemed reasonable at that time. It's no longer reasonable, right? Because that's not the way lines and points behave in curved space-time that we live in, for example. Right? So there are all these kind of things. So when he's proposing this, he could say, I can define it any way I want. But of course, he's simultaneously claiming that this is a reasonable definition for building up a theory of the Greeks and civilization and history and so on, right? And then from that point of view, it's extremely problematic, right? So for example, there was a question earlier, Al-Birun's works were all written in Arabic. So from that point of view, it's clearly an error. That's why I put that among the list of options that came up earlier, in spite of the fact that some historians strenuously argue against this. Most of Newton's works were written in Latin. So there's a Roman mathematician. Any work of Newton that will survive into the future will identify him as a Roman. Even more than that, what else? Yeah, that's right. So we'll sometime in the future, we'll all be included in a global history of the English, right? And if you think about this, by the way, especially here in India, it's actually, and in America, it's very interesting, right? Because if you look at the so-called Greek, say, Hellenistic political entities spread around the ancient world, they point to various ways in which we should think of them as Greek, right? But most of the evidence for doing this, in my view, is much worse than thinking of India and America as British at this point. There's plenty of things named after British institutions here. Lots of educational structures are named after British things. There are people with British sounding names, as well as political figures and institutional heads and so forth, right? How many people think of themselves as British at this point? Yes, you can ask the same thing about America, where it's somehow even worse, right? Almost nobody, the only people in America who believe that, think of them, self-identify as British are people who were born in Britain. Right? Yeah. But in fact, on the basis of general observations like this, part of me, even though I somewhat joke about it, it's really shocked. For many centuries, historians thought that this idea was quite reasonable, and that really formed the core of their theory of identity in the ancient world, especially the identification of Greekness. So so among some of my more historian friends, when I brought up these observations the first time, they were really surprised. It hadn't occurred to them. So that kind of thing is somewhat shocking in a way. Yeah, yeah. Let me comment on that briefly. They don't really do it strictly quantitatively, right? But I am being somewhat unfair, of course, right? Because the language is an important factor, but they take that into account with a lot of way of constructing a story of the ancient world and have a theory of identity that's somewhat more intricate than the way I'm presenting it right now. That's true as well. But nonetheless, I guess I'm also pointing out that definitions like this really do indicate that there are sort of serious deficiencies inserted in so many places. You start doubting the coherence of this structure that's giving rise to the theory. So that, thank you very much for that comment. Right. Okay. Now, to return briefly to Whitehead, right? So we've already attacked this idea that the theoretical Greeks were replaced by the practical Romans and so that kind of things like that. And already somebody else was pointing out the deficiency of using this mythology, right, as the basis of theorizing. That mythology, by the way, most prominently appears in Plutarch's Parallel Lives, which is a source of incredible amount of misinformation as far as I can. It's sort of very strange. I mean, also the strange thing about Plutarch is that he was somebody who did self-identify as a Greek living in the Roman world. And the books were evidently written as propaganda because he wanted to tell the fellow Romans that there were all these Greeks who were as great as the great Romans. He says that's his motivation. Who are as great Romans. He wanted to create a parallel between Greek figures and Roman figures to argue that in spite of being no longer a great civilization, the Greeks are great. So this was, he says that this is his motivation, right? But somehow this political motivation isn't discussed very much in assessing the reliability of the kind of things he says. Anyways, so that's one place where you'll find this myth. The other aspect of this sentence that I also find astounding is, what does he mean by leadership of the European world? Leadership of the European world. What could this possibly mean? That's right. Yeah. So in short, if you take this passage, there's almost no part that's not wrong. It's all wrong. Every single part is wrong. But somehow it's presented as respectable scholarship at a certain point. But let's interrogate that question just a little bit. So here's what Aristotle says about Europeans and Asians as they were classified in his time, right? So you can read those things, but just to summarize, what he's trying to say is, well, the Europeans are very spirited, but they're not very bright. The Asians are very smart, but they have no spirit, so they're enslaved all the time. But the Greeks in the middle are just perfect. It seems like Aristotle didn't think of the Greeks as being the leaders of the European world. Here's a passage from Herodotus. This is not quite as funny, but it's amusing to look at anyway. So this is, sorry, I forgot the precise reference. It's in his histories, but essentially he says, he has no idea why people have divided this continent up into Europe and Asia and Africa. It's completely arbitrary.
So it was divided up actually.
Even in his time, there was a name Europe, there was a name Asia, there was a name Libya. Libya was the name for Africa at the time. That's right. But it didn't make any sense to him from any kind of geographical point of view. So what's going on? So that's what appears in. Right. So then, of course, you can look at something like this picture of the Roman Empire in the 2nd century. A picture of the Roman Empire in the 7th century. Right? So this sense, whether it's the Greeks or the Romans, the sense in which they were leaders of the European world, well, it's very strange to say the very least. But it's very interesting. So when you think about these matters, of course, most of you are aware that much of fair amount of mainstream Europe regards the Greco-Roman heritage as part of European civilization, right? So that's one sense, the perspective from which Whitehead is writing. So that's already very interesting. So there are many questions that you can ask about this, right? So to the United States, to a slightly lesser extent, but in any case, yeah. So all of this is regarded as part of their heritage in some sense, and Whitehead is writing from that point of view. So when I first started asking about these things, to some extent about this Greco-Roman heritage, I think I first started wondering years ago when I started traveling around Europe, especially with my children. I would often buy sort of local history books written for children. Those are very illuminating, right? Because history books written for children often show a kind of local people's sense of identity in a very transparent way. That's somehow hidden in more sophisticated books. And very interesting. So of course, in those books, you already see this common sense of Greco-Roman idea. Sure.
You remember this Lonely Planet?
Oh yeah, of course.
So I walked a lonely planet called Western Europe.
I see. Yeah.
So, and in the back of that, so this was post-Soviet Union, and the back was most of the Western European countries up till Austria or something,
Right.
and Greece.
So
it was disconnected.
Disconnected point.
And that was defined by Lonely Planet as Western Europe.
That's very interesting.
It makes no sense geographically or any topologically
or even culturally, by the way. There's actually
Lonely Planet was
okay. So there's a short video online that I recommend, which is of a very related flavor, by Slavoj Zizek, who's a very funny personality. I don't necessarily like him or anything, but this video is quite amusing. He talks about what it means to be Balkan. It's very similar to what you're talking about. Essentially, what he's saying is that, well, okay, Austrians regard Hungarians as Balkan, Germans regard Austrians as Balkan, the French regard even Germans as Balkan. So just all this kind of stuff. So anyways, I did go around asking people where this common sense of heritage comes from, and there are various historiographic answers to that question. But there's a more stupid question that I also used to ask, about which actually there isn't that much discussion, even among sort of progressive historians, which is related to this question of Greco-Roman identity. I often ask, why does nobody say we invaded Rome? If you read Roman history, of course, there's a big deal made out of the fact that somehow the barbarians invaded Rome, right? But nobody says we invaded Rome. What's going on? So this turns out to be a question. I sort of know the answer to this question, of course, at this point. I mean, there's a superficial answer in the sense that, we pick and choose among the people who inhabited various portions of our past, right? Regard some as ancestors and some as foreign. And what the process for doing this is pretty political, of course, and sometimes kind of random. So somehow people in many parts of Europe now look back on this period of interaction and say, okay, it's actually the Romans who were identical, our ancestors. Those other guys were barbarians, even if we are them. So that's kind of a choice that people make. Another aspect of the answer is actually more complicated. It turns out my current, of course, I haven't done a scholarly study of this by any means, but my feeling is that this adoption of the Greco-Roman identity, and also Greek identity, they are slightly different stories, but it's a very complicated picture and was very uneven even until very recently. So for example, some of you will know figures like this, right? This is, sure. Sorry?
It's not a biological identity.
Yeah. You constructed, of course, right? But you still can ask, what was the motivation for it? How did it come about? In what form? At what time? And so on. Right? So these are the questions we're asking. And part of what I'm pointing out is that this adoption of this identity was fairly uneven even until recent times. Many of you will know characters like this, for example, right? This is Vercingetorix, who was the Gaul general who opposed Caesar in this Battle of Alesia, and you see monuments to him everywhere, all around France, and in paintings and so on. In spite of the fact that they think that it was the Romans who were there at this point, there is a sort of a consensus that Romans were their forebearers. That's right, except in Asterix. That's right. That there are these kind of uneven perturbations to this story as well, right? So one way of saying it is that there's no France, there's no Europe. All of these things are referring to certain specific aspects of a country. So for example, among the topics I quite like right now, sorry, this is taking me on a digression because of your asterisk comment, but in my mind, at the moment, there is no European music. This is a notion that doesn't make sense. So I can discuss this with other people later for anybody who's interested. Anyways, so there are characters like this. And of course, I already referred to this character, right? Hermann, now in German history books of a certain period, was also called Arminius, given the Roman name Arminius at some point. So it was who led the Germanic tribes against the Romans in the Battle of Teutoburg Forest. Even before the Second World War, he appeared frequently in German history books as the first German. It was a very common thing to talk about, even around before, fairly recently, about 100 years ago. Here's another funny example. There are examples like this. It's all over Europe, but I'm just giving you a few famous ones. This is the painting by Rembrandt, Conspiracy of Claudius Civilis, who was also a Batavian chieftain who resisted Roman rule. Somewhere, I guess it was around the 4th century. I may be getting these dates wrong, but roughly around that period. This is by Rembrandt, and it was commissioned by Amsterdam City Council, right, in the early 17th century. So at that point, there was plenty of sympathy for non-Roman identity, right? But these things are gradually ironed out in a way that's through a very complex process. Right. So far I've been saying various scattered things about identities, misconceptions, construction of identity. People have pointed this out, and constructions of civilizational identities and so on. Right? So what am I trying to say here? Some of these things, right? What is the relevance to us as mathematicians and scientists, right? I think that now not everybody has to think about this. Most of you are perfectly right to focus on your mathematics and physics. Yeah? And but sometimes, for some of us as teachers, for example, or people who run institutions like Rajesh, so sometimes we do have to be aware of these other social issues concerned with our conception of history, for example. And in other words, as is very well known, history is very relevant now. I've been told by almost everybody I've spoken to that this is a very correct statement in India right now. Right? History is extremely relevant, kind of a powerful topic, right, in the country at the moment. It seems to be true in many parts of the world. So here I'm giving you a quotation, in a UK quotation. And yeah, again, as with many of the things, this is just a random sample of much broader phenomenon. But this is from the Quality Assurance Agency for Higher Education. So this is a body in the UK that's a kind of an independent body that's entrusted with monitoring and advising on standard and quality in the UK higher education. So it's not, they don't come up with enforceable laws or anything like this, but they do come up with guidelines for educations that are very influential. So a few years ago, in 2022, they came up with this subject benchmark for mathematics, statistics, and operational research, saying this. They very strongly emphasize what they call the multicultural and decolonized view of these subjects informed by the student voice, and that somehow it should, teaching, for example, at the university should reflect this view. So this was a very much discussed and somewhat of a controversial statement for them to have made. A bunch of mathematicians wrote an open letter opposing this benchmark. I'm not going to quote the letter in full, but I should say that the mathematicians who signed this letter were very distinguished. Many of them were very distinguished mathematicians, some of whom I know very well. But anyways, so here's what their response to the benchmark statement said. I've just extracted a portion. So let's read together. The theory of decoloniality is a postmodern critique of the European paradigm of rational knowledge. So in some people's mind, everything bad is postmodern. Right? So, we believe that history suggests that mathematics is not a particularly European paradigm. On the contrary, there have been many examples where the same mathematical ideas have been developed independently across cultures. There's just one example, the Japanese mathematician Seki and the Swiss mathematician Bernoulli both studied what are now called Bernoulli numbers. We agree that where practical, the mathematical community should use terminology that gives non-Western mathematicians proper credit, but this is not the meaning of decoloniality. So aspects of this maybe it's reasonable, and I can see why people were worried about the benchmark statement. And why they might thought, well, we want to focus on mathematics, not politics and history and so on, right? So the motivation that led to this letter was not something I would not, but I'm unsympathetic to. And they make some reasonable points. And in some sense, what's suggested here is what a lot of ethno-mathematics or multicultural mathematics focuses on these days, right? So there are people who talked about what the mathematics of West Africa, mathematics of the Incas, mathematics of India, mathematics of China, and so forth. There are lots of effort, much of it which is very interesting, to sort of implement the multicultural view that the mathematicians suggest is in some sense enough. We don't have to worry about it in our classroom. That's sort of what they're saying. But when I read this statement, as I said, even though I sort of agree with that history suggests that mathematics is not a particular European paradigm, I sort of don't agree too much with what comes afterwards. And the reason I don't agree is because I would ask a more fundamental question besides asking. So the question that's motivating them is, what were the other contributions from outside Europe, right? We should ask them, and it's good to be knowledgeable. And so that's what the point they're making. I would ask a slightly different question regarding this particular sentence. I would ask, who are the Western mathematicians? What is the West? It's the same question. It's the same question. That's right. Who are the Western mathematicians? For example, was Euclid a Western mathematician? Was Pythagoras a Western mathematician? Who are the Western mathematicians anyway? So that, but I think the point is there is sort of a serious difference between asking this question and making the points they're making in this letter, even though I'm not entirely unsympathetic. And this, I believe, is a question that needs to be asked more persistently. And that, in my view, anyways, will do a more effective job of making mathematics accessible to the whole world than finding all these different examples of different traditions and thinking, well, Indian mathematics did these great things, Chinese mathematics did this great thing. Rather, we should be asking, Exactly, who are the Western mathematicians? Why do we think these people are Chinese mathematicians? Who were they influenced by? There are lots of questions of this sort we could be asking, which I feel like is a more effective thing to do. So to return to the question in the title of this lecture, as I said, I think this is obvious, right? And this, I think, by the way, is the positive lesson to be drawn from the Greco-Roman identity of Europe. Yeah. Why? Well, there were lots of political motivations for establishing this Greco-Roman identity. There are lots of complexities surrounding it. But if I would give a simple-minded answer to why somebody in Britain, for example, would regard the Greco-Roman tradition as their own, why do they do that? How can they do that, right? The answer is very simple at a very basic level. Forget about all the politics, the complexities of historiography. One very simple-minded reason why a Briton can regard the Greco-Roman identity as their own is because they studied it. They decided this was worthwhile studying, and they established their own tradition, making this their own. That's why it's regarded as their own. That's sort of related to your comment about the construction of civilization, right? So the mathematics and history, of course, is full of diversity and unity, as I said earlier. And while Whitehead was living in a very strange milieu where, you know, Europeans had claimed the ancient Greco-Roman tradition by embracing and studying it. And there's some funny aspects to it if you relate it to politics, but if you just take that act on its own, you can also view it as a positive thing. They just loved it and they decided to make it their own. So, whereas, of course, as far as any grounds for drawing these connections are concerned, right? Europeans who claimed that tradition certainly were no intrinsically closer to it than Africans, Middle Easterners, South Asians, lots of people, right? Could have claimed that tradition with equal justice, right? From any objective viewpoint, whatever that means, right?
Did claim it at some
They did claim it at some point. That's right, exactly.
Translations were in, I don't know.
Indeed, that's right.
Translated back.
Exactly. So, by the way, so there's a very funny thing about that process as well, right? Many people, even rather progressive and knowledgeable historians, often describe that as a process where it left Europe and came back.
Yeah.
I often say it in this way. It makes no sense whatsoever.
As if they were kind of
That's right.
keepers.
That's right. They're keepers of a European things who returned it to them, right? Yeah, that's right. So when you object about this, right, by the way, almost anybody I spoke to immediately agrees that this makes no sense, right? But somehow it's a fairly entrenched part of the tradition.
Yeah.
Sorry?
European notion.
Yeah.
It's really West
This
Asian.
term,
So all of those
these
ones,
terms,
that's
of course,
right.
are also
Uh-huh.
constructed from,
I was agreeing with you through 90% of your talk, but
Mhm.
now I feel you're skirting around the
Mhm.
main issue, which is these kinds of things where a lot of, parts of the world are sometimes backdated to the Greeks, or, I don't think these are accidental. The identities justify colonialism. After all, if you're going to tremendous violence and kill of people, you have to be barbarians. That's
So I have some comments about that. No, that's fine. I don't disagree with you, and I do have some comments about it, right? And we can discuss that later. But let me, right now, I will avoid that question again, simply by saying that that statement is made often enough. Plenty of people are working on that perspective.
Yeah. I think the mathematicians who often oppose colonization are often tacitly something that has a role even today.
It does.
Even in modern science or sociology.
Right.
I find sometimes, people, there is a vested status quo. Can't really skirt around the question.
No.
You asked all the right questions, but I think now we have to filter.
So let's discuss that a little bit at the end of the talk, and I'll maybe make some comments about that also in one of the later slides. But I think more or less the conclusion I'm trying to draw from my perspective, skirting, anyways, avoiding the point that you're making, that somehow at this point, as far as mathematics is concerned, we can take a positive lesson as well from the Greco-Roman identity of Europe. Of course, by the way, I love a lot of the Greek classics myself. I love Roman classics. I speak a little bit of Latin anyways, and I'm trying to learn Greek whenever I can. So it's not something that I'm against by any means, right? And of course, people who love it can always make it their own. And people who like mathematics. So because this question of role models comes up all the time. So I've spoken to African mathematicians, from people from Ghana and so forth, and who ask about this question of African role models, right? So this is one of the responses I give to them rather regularly. Euclid is definitely a role model for anybody from Nigeria as easily as he might be for Jefferson, for example, right? No? Right. Right. They're very misleading, of course. That's right. That's right. That's right. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah. So a lot of what I'm saying is completely off. Yeah. Yeah. That's right. Yeah. Yeah. So I'm glad that most of you agree, anyways.
And I think there is another.
Yeah. Well, I'm almost done anyway. I'm almost done anyway. So, as I said, so this is simply my conclusion. Who owns mathematics? It belongs to everybody who cares about it, right? And anybody can, in my view, anybody can adopt Euclid as a role model. But I think what you are all of you are also pointing out is to say this in a convincing way. We need to break a lot of old stereotypes. We need more of an accurate understanding, and we need to well, educate ourselves and other people, especially as especially in the classroom, for example, right? So, but by the way, the positive side is now, as I said, I've given this talk in North America and in Europe. For example, at the European Research Center for Mathematics, at a meeting of all the directors of them, almost nobody disagrees at this point. It's not as though there is particular ill will about this perspective, but I still feel like this particular thing, the fact that our sense of identity about the world and the history of mathematics is all mixed up. I don't think this is appreciated well enough. So we ourselves often end up repeating a lot of fairy tales about the history of mathematics, right? And there's that's something about which we need to do a better job. And mathematicians really have nothing to lose and a lot to gain. All mathematicians, including the ones in Europe. I seem to be somehow attacking European mathematics. That's not my intention at all. Almost anybody in Europe also agrees with the sentiments expressed in here. We all have nothing, because we all, by the way, we all believe that there is sort of good mathematics and mathematics that's not as great. Of course, the boundary between them is also indistinct, but we don't think that all mathematics is equal, right? But we can still foster good mathematics without getting ourselves attached to political identity in the present or in the past. That's what I think what I'm trying to say. So I just wanted to conclude by showing you some of the activities we've been doing at ICMS. Fortunately, I'm getting the organization as organizers or proposers, a lot of leading mathematicians, leading historians, not people, just amateur demagogues like me. And, so this was an activity. This was an activity we had at the Korea Institute for Advanced Study of a similar nature. This was a summer school that we had this summer, right? Where this was actually an extraordinary event, because this was a school for students from all over the world. Right? Unfortunately, we couldn't have that many students. It was only around 30, but they really came geographically from all over the world and came from many different disciplines. Some were working on Sumerian mathematics, some working on Egyptian, some working on Indian, some working on Chinese, and so forth, right? And basically, in some sense, the point of the summer school was to convince the young people that these divisions, in fact, don't make that much sense. That we're all there to how to understand that whole story as a unity. So my colleague, Karin Shangla, so she was at the CNRS, now she's moving to Edinburgh just now. And she edited this wonderful book, which I do highly recommend. Right? So it's a deconstruction of this idea that mathematics was invented in ancient Greece with the idea of a proof. Right? She has an introductory essay, this book, that starts with this sentence, and I thought this was a terrific sentence. The standard history of mathematical proof in ancient times, in ancient traditions at the present day, is disturbingly simple. Once I read this, I suddenly realized, of course, it's disturbingly simple. It can't possibly have been like that. Even without any knowledge, you can see that this Euclidean story of proof can't possibly be a reflect reality in real ways. If only because, as mathematicians, none of us follow this Euclidean stereotype of mathematical proof. Who proves things that way anyways, right? But somehow we accepted this as the origin of mathematical proof and even origin of mathematics some way. The way that story is told. Sorry? It's not that old, maybe around 10 years ago. So a lot of these people will tell you that the history of mathematics has undergone a real revolution over the last 40 years or so. There was a really very little, so here I'm going to be slightly prejudiced and I'll talk to people a little bit again, but a lot of the history in the 19th century, even respectable looking history, was, besides the political motivations you're referring to, right? It was strongly influenced by classicists with a certain idea of the way the ancient world must have been. So this generated a lot of fairy tales about mathematics, and the story of mathematical proof, my belief is it's one of them. So in fact, if for those of you who've read Euclid, even Euclid himself is not Euclidean. He doesn't give proofs the way it's supposed to according to the philosopher's picture. So this is a book I would recommend. So this is not quite about mathematics, but this is about the construction of modern Greece, which I do also strongly recommend. So it touches on current affairs as well as the uses of Greek identity and how it was constructed, especially in the 19th century, the process you're referring to. And so it's a short and very readable book. If you travel to Greece, it's a very nice book to carry around because it tells you a lot about things that you actually see. And this is a very popular book about this construction of this idea of the West, very much along the lines of some of your comments. This doesn't go very deeply, but it's kind of an entertaining read anyways. So this book, some of you will have heard about. This was a very controversial book starting in the 1980s and much discussed. I think this is a very inspiring book in many ways and an important book. And even most classicists seem to agree now that this was an important book. They don't agree with all the theories in the book, right? But most people agree that the historiography is very good, for one thing. And secondly, they really did change the discipline. So you see a lot of, so in short, you see a lot of programs of classics, especially in America, becoming much more rigorous than it used to be. People think, that was a lot of the changes happening in classics in America is a lowering of standards. It's actually the opposite. They're raising standards and trying to make it into proper history instead of the kind of thing that Whitehead had studied hundreds of years ago. So, Rajesh, you had a comment?
No, I remember many asking us questions on the facts that what is the verdict?
So I'm not the person to speak about it, but very roughly speaking, the archaeological theories seem to have many, many flaws. But his account of historiography from roughly the 15th to the 19th century Europe seems to be regarded as pretty good. And in particular, that's related to your question. So one of the key theses in this book is that there were two models of ancient history. One was what he calls the ancient model, and the other is what he calls the Aryan model. And the ancient model is a pretty diverse, realistic history, a realistic model of the way the old world functioned. And but his key point is that that model was commonplace even in Europe, roughly up to the 18th century. But that was supplanted in the 19th century by the Aryan model, which is sort of the one that was popularized in subsequent years, and a lot of us learn as children. And he's trying to give an account of this process. But that relates to your question, because I think the colonialism is only part of the story. And one of the reasons that I tend not to focus on that too much is because there's this construction of European, something that you might call European identity, that happens in different stages, starting roughly around the 15th century, conscious construction. Right? And this process isn't necessarily because they're colonialists. It's also establishing their identities against predecessors, for example. As everybody knows, there was a process of European sense of unity against the Muslims, for example, against Islamic civilizations. This was a strong source for wanting some sense of Europe to emerge out of your sense of the ancient world. All of these, it's not. So in other words, it's not just the invasive instinct that leads to this kind of, you know. Not really.
Not
No.
just Britain, that was Portuguese and Spanish, who were very out of it. I mean, British and Dutch.
Yeah.
I think this modern science.
Let me just, sorry. There are many opinions possible.
That was 12th century.
Yeah.
12th and 13th century.
So let me just, that's important. But hang on, let me just ask one question about this regarding what you were saying. Because I think it's important to ask this question. So, or rather, let me first give you an example. If you take somebody like Francesca Petrarch, right, who was a very important figure in European somehow philosophy, literature, and all kinds of things. So he lived in the 14th century, right? And he's somehow regarded as the beginning of the Renaissance. Renaissance is a notion that was only created in the 19th century, by the way. But anyways, so he's often viewed as beginning of the Renaissance, and he expresses a lot of dislike of Muslims, especially Muslim philosophers like Averroes, right? Now, however, if you read his letter, the little bit that I read, I haven't read extensively at all, but the passages about Averroes that I've read, the main reason he doesn't like Averroes is because Averroes is an Aristotelian and Petrarch doesn't like Aristotle. So it's very mixed. There are reasons for likes and dislikes. So this idea of Europe against Muslims is not something that's such a clear concept at this time already. So, or in other words, Venetians may have hated Turks. They also hated Genoans. They also had, French may have hated, well, I mean, so the intra-European rivalries and dislikes were just as strong as any dislike that they may have directed towards the Muslims. So this sense of Europe against the rest of the world, I think, is a much more recent creation than 15th century, for example. So these are the issues that one needs to address, I think, in full complexity to understand this phenomena. And the idea of colonialism, the post-colonial analysis tends to focus too much on this Europe versus rest of the world and predates this ideology, sort of projects this ideology much longer ago than we can find concrete evidence for. So that's the reason I don't fully agree with the kind of. Right. Sure, of course, let's try you. Okay. Absolutely. Sure. But even that, people choose to attach different significance to past events as well in the light of current concerns. Because remember, even in the 19th century, it was common to refer to Turkey as the sick man of Europe. That was a common terminology in those days. Right? So this sense of division, how clear it was, is not so obvious at all. Anyway, so this book is a very worthwhile thing to read as general orientation. And in particular, he does point out that a lot of these things, which may be regarded as radical now, was pretty commonplace up to the 18th century. Right? The alternative, of course, is to believe in something like this, right? And so what I'm worried, by the way, in regard to your point, is that a lot of the post-colonial analysis tends to buy into this framework, even while they are criticizing colonialism and Eurocentrism and so on. They implicitly buy into this framework that there are all these different civilizations that can be divided somewhat in some way and that clash against each other and sometimes into artificially ancient times. Yeah.
I agree.
Yeah, of course, that's right. Mhm. Right. Yeah. Mhm. Sure, of course, that's right. Mhm. So this is a very complicated issue, of course, right? But I would say, so my own conviction in some sense is that challenging the boundaries through space-time, right, is one of the effective ways of opposing these ideas. And I have a feeling that this maybe I'm kidding myself about it, but I have a feeling this is an idea that hasn't received as much attention as it should have, in particular in the realm of mathematics, its history, and its education. And that's what I'm talking about here. Thank you very much.
Great, Minhyong.
It was a tremendously stimulating talk. So I'm sure there'll be questions. We'll probably go on forever with questions, but I mean, you can continue here discussing. I think maybe I will. I think I personally have to leave for something right now, but I encourage people to just continue talking here if they feel like. So once again, thanks for all the talks.